So this whole series has turned into a wreck. I don't know where half my footage is. It all got deleted. And this is like the best part about rebuilding the engine. I'm putting all the pistons on, all the rings, everything is going on, and it all got deleted. Fortunately, I do have the part where I put the cylinders on the engine, but everything else, it just disappeared, and that kind of sucks because that's like the most exciting part when you put your new pistons on. But all it was just C-clips, a wrist pin, and then the bearing, and that goes on through the connecting rod, and that's how I pretty much put a piston on. It's a really easy process, but it still sucks I lost it because that'd be a really cool part to include in the series. But here is the rest of the series with me putting the whole engine back together and in the jet ski. Let's get to it. Okay, so I had 4 guys help me lift this engine out. We used some mover straps, and it was just 8 screws to remove, and we pretty much just slid the engine forward and then lifted it up. Now that we have the engine out, I am ready to examine the reed valves. All I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this part, which is what the carburetor mounts to. I guess I should probably mention this real quick, but another reason why I took the whole engine out is because in pretty much all of the videos where the guys put the cylinders on, they have their engines out of the actual jet ski. So I think this is definitely the best practice to do. Alright, so I'm cleaning the reed valves right now. All I'm doing is just running some WD-40 through them and just lightly wiping them down with a paper towel. Alright, so it's the next day and I'm feeling absolutely sick and terrible, but it's not going to stop me from working on the jet ski. We're going to take our cleaned out reed valves and we're going to put them back into the engine after we mount them back to the intake. I tested these reed valves and they were fine. The way I test them is I just take my finger lightly, pull them back, make sure they spring back nice and quick. Make sure they're not stuck when I pull them back either. Now I'm going to reassemble the reed valves and put it back on here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean off this surface. Should stick on. Make sure to align the screw holes perfectly. I'm going to reinstall our reed valves that I cleaned. So I'm going to put the screws into our reed valves. Then I'm going to do the center one so it has the best support for the gasket. Now I'm going to do the other two. Okay, so now I'm just going to torque these screws down so they're tighter. We are now on our reassembly stage and we're actually putting it back together now. There should be no more taking apart of anything. We're going to reinstall our reed valve assembly. This is just going to slide in. Just like that. I'm going to hold it there. I'm going to take our 2 right and left screws. I'm going to put those in. Okay, now that's in place. I'm going to finish the rest of these screws. So I have my torque wrench here. I'm going to torque these screws to 6.5 foot-pounds. Most of these screws don't show, so I'm just going to do this off camera. But to do it, all you do is you take your wrench, you hook it up to the screw, and you twist it until you hear a click or until it stops. And that's when you know you're done. Okay, so as we can see, when I tighten this screw, it's going to keep tightening. It'll stop like that. This will kind of bend, and that's when you know to stop. Okay, so I'm not going to put the carburetors on just yet because I think it is time to put the cylinder on. Just so we have the maximum room to move around with, and I don't want the carburetors in the way. So installing the cylinder is probably going to be the hardest part of this whole job because there's a little bit of a trick to it and it can be a bit finicky. So what you do is I'm going to have the middle piston as the tallest one, then I'm going to have someone, or maybe myself depending on if I do it by myself, compress these piston rings. Then we're going to place the cylinder on top of this and it should hopefully just slide on right into the piston. Then I'm going to take my front piston, we're going to do that to this one then our back one, which will be the lowest into the engine, and hopefully if everything goes well, they should just slide right on after I can have someone compress these rings. It is a bit finicky like I said, but I think we can do it. I'm going to try doing it by myself, probably an extremely bad idea. I'm just going to gently let this rest on here. I'm going to plan how I'm going to do the rest of these because I got this one in, it took forever, and I don't want to mess this up and have this lift off and start this process all over again. So I'm going to plan this out, kind of nervous. I've already kind of fucked up these pistons, the middle piston a bit, the scoring and all that, but that's just the outer layer. So hopefully it doesn't mess with compression or anything. It shouldn't. Now we're ready for the second one. Okay, we almost have it. Okay, there's our second piston on. Okay, time for our third piston. Just like that, we have all 3 pistons in the cylinder. Now we're gonna gently slide this all the way down into position. Still gonna go slow and not gonna force anything. There we go. I'm gonna give it a quick tap, light tap with a mallet just to make sure there's no space between the gasket and the engine. Okay, so there's 8 screws total. There's 2 40 nanometer screws and the rest are 29 nanometers. The 2 40 nanometer screws, they're gonna go on these sides right here on the back towards the exhaust manifold, on the edges, and then the rest of them are gonna go on the remaining areas. So now I'm gonna torque our 40 nanometer bolts too. All right. Our remaining screws are gonna be 17 foot-pounds. Okay, just like that, now they're all torqued down. Okay, so now I'm gonna install our carburetors. These don't have to be installed to a certain torque spec. You just want them nice and tight so they don't fall off. Okay, so I did some work off camera once again because things didn't work out right. But now we have the engine crankcase split. As you can see, the beautiful crank is sitting here, just kind of sagging out, not really putting stress on anything at least, but I had to remove this because I did forget one thing, almost. Crank seals. The engine did not blow because of the carburetors, but rather because of the crank seals. There used to be some here, and they completely blew out. As you can see, these aren't looking too good. Or I don't know where the other one is, but one of them has a completely cracked part. So crank seals is what probably most likely blew my engine because that causes a lean air fuel mixture, and I thought it's very necessary to show how to replace these in this video because this is probably most of people's problems in a 2-stroke when they blow, other than mileage and maybe carburation issues still. I'm continuing off from where I put the cylinder over the piston. As you can see, that's in place. I haven't put the head on just yet, and I haven't put the carburetors on just yet because I need to fix this first. So what I did to get the crankcase split, I took off the engine mounts. Next what I did is I took off the flywheel cover. To remove the flywheel, I had to get a flywheel or puller tool. You can get a specific one for these, but I don't like those because you're buying one and you might never even use it again. I like the universal ones because I do work on flywheels a lot and I've removed 3 so far in my life. So having a universal tool is much better. After that, I had to remove the PTO, and that was a really hard process because it would not come off. So what I had to do is I had to shove some rope up in my cylinders, and while I was doing that, I cranked on that part really hard. I had all the screws out on the bottom, and because the crankcase was so hard to split, that also helped split the crankcase. But after that, what I did is I heated this part up down here. I heated up the PTO to about 260 degrees, and then I cranked it again, and it completely came off very easy. So there's some tricks. I guarantee if yours is stuck, that'll work. Just rope in the cylinder, put the head on, a few screws, crank on this piece, it'll split the crank as well as break the PTO off. So now I'm gonna put my new crank seals in. Okay, so I have the engine lifted upright, upside down. So the first crank seal we're gonna replace is the front one. If you're replacing your back ones, you probably want to replace the front one too. Okay, so here I have my crank seals. These are as you can see, these are the genuine Yamaha ones. These are parts you really don't want to cheap out on because you really don't want to come back here just to replace cheap crank seals that blow out already. So I go with the Yamaha ones. They even say don't use the SBT ones, and that's actually what I had on here before. And those blew out, and I think this engine only had about 100 and something hours on it, so it really did not last long. So before I replace my crank seal, we're going to clean off this mating surface. I'm going to use my plastic gasket removal tool, which works really good without scratching the surfaces because it's a softer material. Okay, so now that I've removed most of the heavier stuff of the Yama bond and 3-bond, I'm going to go over now with some alcohol or seafoam and use a rag. I'm just going to wet it with the seafoam. I'm just going to rub it really hard on all the areas where there's still a little bit of residue left. Okay, now I got most of the gasket surfaces clean. Pretty satisfied with it. I'm just gonna take the dry part of my towel and just kind of wipe it down everywhere. Because seafoam and other chemicals do leave a little bit of a film behind that I really don't want, because I want a very good seal in here. That looks pretty good. There's a tiny bit of residue left, but there's not much I can really do about it. You definitely don't want to use steel wool. I tried that, and it just creates a big cotton mess of steel flakes everywhere. You don't want to use that. I had to remove all of them after I learned the hard way. So stay away from steel wool, but there are, of course, pads you can get in orbital devices that can really get this looking really good, but this trick worked for me pretty well, so I'm pretty satisfied. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of clean these bearings and get a new layer of oil, Yamaha lube on them, just so they're pretty fresh and clean. Okay, so now I'm just going to repeat the same process on the crankcase cover. There's a lot of residue on here too, so obviously this is important to remove this too. Okay, so I've got most of the Yamaha bond removed. It looks pretty good. It'll definitely make a good seal. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to clean off this whole entire area on the inside with some degreaser, as well as this crankcase part. I'm going to remove all the grease and put some new grease in, so we have some fresh lubrication on all the parts. That is looking very, very, very clean. So we're ready to put the seals in and put the crank cover back on and officially start putting the engine back together and in the jet ski. This is getting exciting. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean the gaskets off this part right here, as well as get all the old grease out of here so we can put new grease in. Okay, so what I did is I turned these two counterweights half churned this way, and this just releases the crankshaft a little bit more, so now I can fit the seals in here, as well as clean out these little divots where the seals place in, so I can get the Yamaha bond out of here too. Okay, so I got the areas where the crank seals go looking very clean. There's not really any stuff sticking out of them, so it should be a very good seal. Then another thing I did is I just poured some gas down each one of these cylinders, and then I put my pump on there, just suck it out, because there was a little bit of debris from scraping all the Yamaha bond off. So now everything in here is very, very clean. This counterweight is still offset just so I can lift it up a bit. As you can see, it gives me about a millimeter of lift, which is just enough to get the crank seals in. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to place some Yamaha bond into these divots where the crank seals go, on these two, as well as this one. To start things off, I'm going to open this package up. So in the package, we get this little tip for applying the 3-bond or the Yamaha bond. I'm going to cut it to a small size first so I can apply it into these grooves. I'm going to cut the tip wider. I'm going to place it all around the mating surfaces. I'm going to use this little spatula thing they give you and just make it real nice and smooth, a pretty thin but decent amount layer. Okay, so before we put our crank seals in, we're just going to take a small amount of marine grease, and we're just going to apply a little bit of a layer inside of here so there's some lubrication when this part is here, because it sits in place while your crankshaft spins, so that grease will provide nice lubrication for it to spin and not instantly wear out this part. The seal has two sides, obviously. One has a little bit of a metal color ring showing right here, and on the other side it's completely black with a spring, but the other side has a spring as well. So I'm going to take the side with the metal part showing. I'm just going to insert it towards the crankshaft, just like so, and then I'm going to get a piece to hammer this in because it is a very tight fit. Here we go. So our crank seal is in now. I'm going to make sure it's aligned with these holes where it goes into, and I'm just going to drop it down with the brick. This all looks good to me. Okay. Just like that. Now this isn't down all the way just yet because it's still, these counterweights are still lifted up, but once I drop it down fully, it should make a pretty good seal. I have to do this in under an hour because this stuff does start to seal and become hard in an hour. So, okay, so this crank seal is going to be a bit harder because there's a little other piece we have to replace. This part right here, it looks like it's part of the crankshaft, but it's actually not. It's a little metal ring. I'm going to have to figure out how to remove this in under an hour before the Yamaha bond dries. Probably should have thought this out, but this is the part right here. It's just a little ring. I did want to replace this because I do feel a little bit of a groove in here, and this part feels pretty worn out. So I want this to be perfect, so I'm going to replace this part too. I'm going to use some blowtorch to heat it up. want to get my bearings too hot. I really wish I recorded this because this part just flew into my face. That actually hurt. So here's what I did. I took my Dremel. I cut this piece. This piece is made out of aluminum. The drive shaft right here. This is actually steel. So once the Dremel hits it, it starts sparking. Very clear indicator of when to stop cutting on here. So I just kept cutting along this piece right here. Once I saw spark, I kind of moved along. And I got to halfway and then started hitting the bearing. So what I did then is I took my flathead screwdriver, I kind of pried it into part here and then part there, and I kept hammering it, and it actually was able to split and cut the metal, and once it finally got it, it shot up into my face. So that's how you remove a collar. Probably not the best method ever, it's kind of redneck, but it works. I'm just going to clean this piece off now. So I'm going to put my new collar on there. It's probably going to be really hard to put on too, but okay, we have the collar installed. It's coming out a tiny, very little tiny bit at the bottom, but I can't get it any further. It is pretty flush with the crankshaft at least, so we're ready to install our other two crank seals. I'm going to fill these two holes, these two divots right here with some Yamaha once again, and we're going to continue. Okay, so there are two seals right here that we have, and looking at the assembly documentation, there's the parts end in 33 and 46. The one ending in 33 goes closer towards the crankshaft. So we're obviously going to install this piece first. One thing I forgot to mention, you're supposed to put grease in between these parts too, and I did not do that, so I have to take this out now. Okay, our two seals are in. Now we're ready to readjust our counterweights so this sits down into the engine. And we can start putting on the crankcase cover again. Okay, so now we want to fill these divots as well, where the crank seals go. There's some down here too. So there's two divots here. This is where your crank seals go. You want to fill those with Yamaha. Then there's a third one right here. You don't want to fill this one because this is just simply a C-clip for your bearing. Okay, so I'm just going to do a thin, even coating around all of the mating surfaces with this little spatula. So you cut your tip on here, obviously your bottle, and you just start making lines all across your mating surfaces, just like this. Want that to look real nice and a good even layer. Okay. Okay, after that, we're going to take our little spatula that comes in the bottle, or a putty knife, same thing, and you're just going to evenly coat it and spread it around. So there we have it. Our 3-bond has been added, has been applied. I'm just going to wipe off the excess on the inside of the crankcase, just like that, and we're going to do that all around here. Okay, so I have my Yamaha applied. It looks very clean and even. Now we're ready to put this on back to the engine and seal up our crankcase. Okay, now we're going to put our crankcase back in place. I'm going to go as even and as lined as possible so I don't smear this Yamaha anywhere. Just like so. Bam. I'm just going to give it some light taps with a mallet to seal it a little bit more. Okay, so now we're going to screw this down. Okay, so now I'm going to bolt down the crankcase. The screws are already in. We're going to start with 11 foot-pounds and then we're going to do 20 foot-pounds. Okay, now we're going to do 20 foot-pound torque. There's numbers printed on the crankcase for the order you should put these screws on. I forgot to mention that. So we're gonna follow that to 20 foot-pounds and we're gonna finish the rest of this off. Okay, so now I'm gonna wipe away any excess Yamaha bond that is splurged out from me tightening down the crankcase. Your crankcase put back together and it's looking all pretty. You wanna let it sit for about an hour. You can still work on it, but if in the case that you manage to get your engine completely assembled within an hour, you do wanna let it sit so it can actually form a gasket. And the best practice would be to let it sit for a full 24 hours so that Yamaha bond can really form a perfect seal. Okay, so the last piece we're going to replace is just this little O-ring. This goes in between the PTO and the crankshaft. I'm just going to slide it on. Then I'm going to put my PTO in. I'm not going to tighten it down all the way, but eventually I'll get to that. There's a little cutout on the PTO that O-ring goes around. You just want to put it on there, and then later on we will turn this in all the way because it's locked right now. Okay, now we're going to start reassembling our flywheel assembly. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean off the whole starter gear assembly. I'm going to wipe all the grease off and then apply new grease. Okay, now I'm going to take our starter gear assembly, which goes like this direction. I'm going to insert it into this little bearing area right there. And that mounts in just like that. Okay, now I'm going to get this little dowel piece that connects to the flywheel. I'm going to insert it in this little groove right here. Now we're going to grab our flywheel. And this goes on in this direction, so this indent is outside of the engine. There's a little groove in here that'll align with this pin. I'm going to line those. Okay, and that's in now. Now we're just going to hammer this down a tiny bit just so it's all the way back, and we're going to install our screw. Okay, now we're going to hand thread the screw that holds down the flywheel. I'm not going to torque it down just yet because I don't have the engine head on. And what we do is we put a piece of rope up in the engine head so we can actually apply torque to this without the engine freely spinning. Okay, so just like I did when I assembled it, I'm going to take some rope and I'm just going to coil it up inside the front piston. Now I'm going to get my head, and I'm going to place that on. I'm just going to put the front few bolts on. I'm not going to torque them down or anything, I'm just going to put them on nice and tight. Okay, now we're going to torque this down to 50 foot-pounds. Now our flywheel is torqued down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a thin layer of grease all around the flywheel gear. Now I'm going to install the PTO. I'm going to use the same method I did to take it off, which is just using a pry bar, which works fine. Alright, our PTO is installed. That little seal is making a good contact with the crank seals, so now we're ready to take off the head and finish this. Last thing I'm going to do for the grease is I'm going to apply a little bit of grease around the pinion gear of our starter motor. I also applied a little bit of grease around the O-ring for the starter motor just so that creates a better seal. Okay, next I reinstalled the starter motor. That just slides right in. And then there's two screws that will hold it in place. Okay, now we are finally ready to put our flywheel stator housing back together. So I already have the oil pump and the flywheel screw aligned, so it should just slide right on. I took the two pins and I put them here. Now I'm going to put my gasket on. Okay, now we're going to slide the flywheel cover right on. I'm just going to get a mallet so I can push it through the pins. I'm going to get my screws, I'm just going to insert these into the engine. Okay, now I'm going to torque these bolts down to 25 foot-pounds. Okay, so I couldn't find any torque specs for the flywheel cover screws, so I'm going to do a safe 10 foot-pounds. This should be plenty to hold it in. It might even be too much, but we'll just do a 10. Now I have the engine tipped over again. We're going to install the mounting brackets. We're going to torque them down to 17 foot-pounds first. Okay, on our second run, we're going to do 38 foot-pounds. Now we're ready to place these carburetors on. Okay, we're just going to hand thread our nuts. Okay, our carburetors are installed. We are going to wait to have this engine in the jet ski to put the head on. But it looks like we are just about ready to put this back into the jet ski and hook it all up. Okay, we have lifted the engine in. It's ready to be aligned once again with the shaft. And we're gonna rehook up everything, including oil lines and electrical. Okay, so now I'm gonna slide the engine back. We're gonna align it with the shaft right here. So as we push it back, we're just gonna rotate the engine a little bit, or the shaft, doesn't matter which one, just to get these in the right alignment so they can slide onto each other. These just get gently placed on the ground behind the carburetors. After that, we're gonna plug them in. Okay, we're just gonna run this wire, which is where the power comes from, the stator. Just gonna fit this grommet into this hole right here where it's supposed to slide in. Just like that. Then we're gonna get our plug. We're gonna plug these two wires in. Okay. Just gonna tighten them all the way. Just like that. Then we're just gonna get this other wire, which is the other half of the stator wire. This is probably all the sensors and stuff. Okay. Gonna plug that in. Okay, now there's two green wires that need to be plugged in. I did tape these in masking tape just to mark them, but I think they are the same. They are the same wires, just two of them, so probably not a big deal. Last but not least, there's just this little ground cable right here. I'm gonna route that behind all these wires, and then that's gonna hook up in this little corner up here. There's a little screw. Just gonna fit this wire into this screw. Okay. And there's another wire already back here. I'm just gonna feed that into here too. Okay, that's installed. These all just tuck behind this piece right here, and this tightens onto them to hold them in place. Alright, just like that. I'm gonna slide this connector into here. It's a pretty tight fit. They all should fit. Okay, now I'm gonna hook up the electric starter wires. Positive goes here and ground goes at this screw right here. Okay, now I'm just gonna hook up the remaining oil lines. This one, which is not a clear hose, this connects back here into the corner. It's this little piece right here. The other three I'm still gonna leave free. And then there's this hose right here, which is like the main oil tank hose. That hooks up down here. You'll probably remember if you took it off. Okay, now I'm gonna hook up our fuel lines. These two hoses that come out of the engine, where the reeds are, these are our pulse lines. These hook up to the pulse lines on the carburetor. It's these little hoses right here with the silver end here, and there's another one over here, a little hose over here too. Then this hose up here, this is the fuel return line. That's gonna hook up to this end of the carburetor hosing system, and this hose over here on the ground is gonna hook up to this part of the carburetor hosing. Okay, so the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna attach this throttle plate assembly, and then I'm gonna attach the throttle wires to the carburetors. Okay, so we have the throttle cables attached. The throttle is working, as well as the oil pump, which is also attached. I also made sure the choke was working, and now we are ready to install the exhaust manifold. Okay, now I'm going to get my combination wrenches to put these in as much as I can, and we're going to pull out the torque wrench. So now I have my torque wrench set up with a 12mm socket. We're going to crank these exhaust bolts to 22 foot-pounds. Okay, so it's going to be a little hard to get the camera in this corner, but the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the shield over the drive shaft, so that'll protect all the cables and stuff from hitting it. Okay, now it's time to say goodbye to our beautiful rebuilt engine, and we're going to put the engine head on. Okay, so the little tab for the gasket, that's going to go towards the back of the engine. Just going to lay this on top. To align the head properly, these three bigger screw studs, those are for the exhaust, so we know those go on this side. I'm gonna try not to drag it, so I'm just gonna align it as best as I can. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna tighten all of these screws on the head to 2.9 foot-pounds. And we're gonna make a second round doing 5.8 foot-pounds. I've already done 2.9 off camera, so I'm gonna do 5.8 now. Okay, those are all torqued down to 20 foot-pounds. I double checked the torque of the other screws too, just to make sure those are all in good. Now we're ready to put the wide pipe on. I'm gonna start by inserting this rear part of it into the hose. Okay, I got my muffler put in. There's just a little bit of a gap back here where that goes into the manifold, but once I tighten the screws, that'll fix that up. Back here, I'm just gonna finish hooking it up to this hose. So I'll be off camera just because it's a hard spot to record, and it's just me out here, so. Okay, so I have these 2 screws for the exhaust put in to the head. These screws down here, I didn't find a torque rating for these, so I just tightened them nice and tight so they don't come out. Now I'm gonna torque these ones down to 22 foot-pounds. Now we're gonna attach the exhaust brace, which hooks up also to the head. I'm gonna torque the exhaust brace to 29 foot-pounds. Okay, now with the other 2 remaining screws, I'm gonna torque those into the exhaust. These also go in as 22 foot-pounds. Okay, now I have all the hoses loosely fitted. This is the bigger one. This attaches here on the exhaust pipe. This is the exit. I already covered this. This part right here is a really short hose that attaches to the exhaust. On the opposite end of that, there's another hose. This goes all the way around to here, up front to the engine head right there. That goes there. As you can see, we are coming together here. We are so close to being done. All we have to do is put the intake manifold on top of the carburetors and install the spark plugs. I'm going to leave them off for now because I'm going to show you how to prime your oil. We're getting really close, so this is really exciting. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install this little mid plate. There's 2 screws that hold it on, as well as this little ground wire that was hanging down here earlier. There's also 2 grease lines that hook up to here. You'll see the little fittings on the bottom of those. Okay, so there's one last part I forgot to do, which is the temperature sensor for the exhaust. Probably want to do this before you put on your cooling lines just because it's a harder spot to access now, but we're going to put that on next. It's just these 2 screws that'll hold it on. There is no torque spec for these either. Okay, now we are ready to install our intake manifold. I have it in position, but before we do that, there are 3 oil lines on the bottom of it we're going to want to hook up our oil lines to. Okay, now we're going to take our 12 Allen head screws and we're going to screw them into the intake manifold, which screws into the carburetor. This will secure the manifold. Okay, now I'm going to take these little rubber pieces. I'm going to insert them into these holes right here. This is where they go. Then, I'm going to take one of these little brackets that holds them in. I'm going to screw them in with the little edge that faces down. I'm going to get a screw, and I'm going to secure them in. Okay, those are in. Okay, last but not least, I am going to finish off this job by putting a cover on the intake. These little flanges go towards the engine. Just like that. And this piece should just cap on. Okay, we have our cover on, it's bolted in, and we're ready. Okay, so I hope you all enjoyed this video. I'm going to have to end it here because I'm sure when I put this video in post, it's going to be a very long video. So, thanks for watching. In the next episode, I'm going to finish by putting the spark plugs in and we're going to get this thing running. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.